The morning sun, still gentle, cast long shadows across the ancient stone walls of the Church of St. Michael, illuminating the weathered face of Pastor Elias. His hands, gnarled by years of tending to his flock and toiling in the small village garden, meticulously arranged the communion wafers. Elias was more than just a pastor. He was the spiritual anchor of this secluded Christian community nestled deep within the verdant, yet increasingly volatile, Lebanese mountains. His sermons, often laced with parables of peace and forgiveness, resonated deeply within the hearts of his parishioners, offering solace amidst the ever-present anxieties of a region perpetually on the brink. For decades, he had been their unwavering pillar of stability, his faith a comforting beacon in turbulent times. His devotion was absolute, a quiet strength that permeated every aspect of his life. He knew every family by name, every child's dream, every elder's worry. The weight of their spiritual and often temporal well-being rested squarely on his broad shoulders, a burden he carried with profound humility and grace. Yet a new, insidious weight had begun to press down on him, a subtle but persistent tremor beneath the surface of their tranquil existence. The escalating tension in the wider region, a distant hum on the news, had slowly but surely crept closer to their peaceful valley. Hezbollah's presence, once a distant rumor, was now an undeniable reality, its tendrils extending further into the rural landscape. Elias often found himself staring out from his study window, overlooking the winding mountain roads, a knot tightening in his stomach. His pacifist beliefs clashed violently with the burgeoning threat to his cherished flock. How could he preach peace when the drums of war grew louder with each passing day? His internal struggle was a silent, agonizing battle fought within the confines of his own conscience. He believed in turning the other cheek, in the sanctity of all life. But what if turning the other cheek meant exposing his people to unimaginable peril? The dilemma gnawed at him, eroding the bedrock of his long-held convictions. Lately, his observations had grown unsettling. What began as an occasional glimpse of unfamiliar vehicles on rarely used tracks had escalated into a pattern. Heavy-duty trucks, unmarked and moving with an almost military precision, traversed the narrow roads at odd hours, their cargo obscured. He saw men, not from the village, congregating near abandoned farmhouses on the outskirts, their movements furtive, their glances sharp. These were subtle signs, easily dismissed by the less observant. But Elias possessed a shepherd's keen eye for anything amiss within his pasture. He sensed a strategic purpose, a calculated positioning that spoke of more than just simple transit. Hezbollah was not merely passing through. They were entrenching themselves, weaving a network of unseen fortifications around his unsuspecting village. One Sunday, as the last strains of the morning hymn faded, a visitor lingered after the service. He was a man Elias had never seen before, impeccably dressed with eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the church, and most disconcertingly, every nuance of Elias himself. He introduced himself simply as David, a traveler passing through, drawn by the church's ancient beauty. His smile was cordial, almost too perfect, and his gaze, though polite, held an unnerving intensity. David made no overt move, spoke no controversial words, yet his presence was a palpable disruption to Elias's routine. He sat in the pews during the sermon, observing the pastor with an almost scientific detachment. A subtle, unsettling scrutiny. Elias felt the weight of those eyes throughout the service, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. A growing sense of unease began to settle over Elias, a premonition of darker times ahead. David's visit, seemingly innocuous, felt like the first ripple of a coming storm. The pastor, a man accustomed to finding comfort in routine and prayer, now found his thoughts plagued by an unfamiliar anxiety. The world outside, with its conflicts and machinations, was no longer a distant echo. It was pressing in, threatening to engulf his quiet village and force him to confront choices he had never imagined possible. The air itself seemed to thicken with unspoken implications, and Elias, with his shepherd's heart, felt a profound, chilling certainty that the tranquility he had so carefully nurtured was about to shatter. The following afternoon, David reappeared, not at the church but at Elias's modest rectory, his knock firm and deliberate. This time there was no pretense of casual tourism. His eyes, though still polite, now held a glint of steel, reflecting a purpose far removed from spiritual contemplation. He introduced himself again, but with a nuanced correction. "My name is David, Pastor Elias, and I am here representing a group deeply concerned with the stability of this region, and more specifically, the safety of communities like yours." The words were carefully chosen, devoid of any explicit affiliations, yet the implication hung heavy in the air. Elias, a man accustomed to the gentle cadence of prayer and scripture, instantly recognized the shift in tone, the subtle undercurrent of authority. This was not a traveler. This was an operative. David's initial approach was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He spoke with genuine admiration for Elias's dedication, praising his unwavering commitment to his flock, his reputation as a beacon of peace and wisdom. He painted a vivid picture of the village, highlighting its unique cultural heritage, its peaceful coexistence, and the pastor's pivotal role in maintaining that delicate balance. "Men like you, Pastor, are the very bedrock of this society," David intoned, his voice laced with an almost reverential respect. "Your influence, your moral compass, these are invaluable assets, especially in these turbulent times." He appealed directly to Elias's deepest concern, the well-being of his community, framing their conversation as a shared desire to protect the innocent from unseen dangers. Then came the pivot, the presentation of evidence that shattered the idyllic facade David had just constructed. From a sleek, unobtrusive tablet, he displayed satellite imagery, crisp and disturbingly clear. Red circles highlighted strategic points around the village: an abandoned quarry, a seemingly innocuous orchard, a derelict barn. Each circle was accompanied by intelligence reports, concise and chilling, detailing Hezbollah's systematic entrenchment. There were diagrams of underground tunnels, projected troop movements, and even intercepted communications, all pointing to the transformation of the peaceful countryside into a potential battlefield. "They are not just passing through, Pastor," David stated, his voice now devoid of flattery. "They are building a fortress, using your people as human shields, your homes as their cover." The moral dilemma was stark, laid bare before Elias like an open wound. David offered no direct command, no explicit threat. But the choice was clear: act to protect his people, to preempt the inevitable conflict, or remain passive, clinging to his pacifist ideals, and risk their destruction at the hands of those who would exploit their innocence. "True faith, Pastor," David argued, his gaze unwavering, "is not merely about prayer and contemplation. It is about action, about safeguarding those entrusted to your care. What good is a shepherd who watches his flock led to slaughter?" Elias, recoiling from the brutal reality presented, initially rejected the proposition. "My vows," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "My church is a sanctuary, not a battleground. I cannot betray my calling, my sacred duty." He spoke of the sanctity of human life, the unholy nature of espionage, the corrosive effect of violence on the soul. His conviction, though shaken, was still formidable. David, however, was prepared. His counter-argument was delivered with a quiet intensity that bypassed Elias's theological defenses and aimed directly at his pastoral heart. "True faith, Pastor," he reiterated, "sometimes requires difficult choices for the greater good. Is it not a betrayal of your flock to allow them to be unknowingly drawn into a conflict they did not choose? Is it not a greater sin to stand idly by while their lives are jeopardized?" A veiled threat, subtle yet potent, followed. "Inaction, Pastor, can lead to far worse outcomes for your village. When the inevitable confrontation comes, and it will, those who could have prevented it will bear a heavy burden. Think of the children, the elderly. What will become of them if this village becomes a stronghold?" The words hung in the air, a chilling premonition that pierced Elias's soul, leaving him vulnerable to the serpent's whisper. The pressure, once a subtle hum in the background of Elias's thoughts, now intensified into a deafening roar. David, sensing the pastor's weakening resolve, pressed his advantage with surgical precision. He produced more detailed intelligence, not just general locations, but specific examples of Hezbollah's plans that directly impacted Elias's congregation. There was information about a planned weapons cache beneath the old olive grove where children often played, a hidden surveillance post disguised as a shepherd's hut overlooking the main road into the village, and even a recruitment drive targeting the disillusioned youth of Elias's flock, promising purpose and power. David spoke of these developments not as abstract military maneuvers, but as direct threats to the daily lives, the very fabric of Elias's community. Each revelation chipped away at the pastor's remaining defenses, painting a grim picture of a future he desperately wanted to avert. Then came the calculated, almost cruel personal connection. David, with a seemingly casual shift in tone, began to speak of Elias's family. He mentioned the pastor's elderly sister, who lived in a small cottage near the village's edge, a cottage that, according to David's intelligence, lay perilously close to a planned Hezbollah supply route. He spoke of Elias's nephew, a bright young man studying abroad, whose return home might place him in unforeseen danger if the village became a contested zone. There were no overt threats, no menacing gestures, only a subtle implication, a chilling reminder of their vulnerability, their proximity to the encroaching shadows. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, a direct strike at the heart of Elias's love and responsibility, bypassing his theological arguments and striking at his most primal fears. This was Elias's breaking point. The abstract notion of his people suddenly coalesced into the faces of his sister, his nephew, the children playing in the olive grove. The realization dawned with a sickening clarity. His inaction, his adherence to a pacifism that seemed increasingly untenable in the face of such calculated aggression, could directly harm those he swore to protect. The weight of this potential consequence crushed his spirit. He saw a future where his moral purity would be stained by the blood of his loved ones, a future he could not bear. The sanctuary of his church, once a haven of peace, now felt like a cage, trapping him in a moral dilemma from which there seemed no escape but surrender. With a heavy sigh that carried the burden of 1,000 unspoken prayers, Elias reluctantly agreed. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, laden with a profound sense of defeat. He would provide information, but only under strict conditions. No direct involvement in violence, no targeting of innocents, and a guarantee that his village would be protected. David, a flicker of triumph in his eyes, readily agreed to these terms, knowing full well that such promises were often fluid in the harsh realities of espionage. For Elias, it was a Faustian bargain, a pact made in desperation to save his flock, yet one that he knew would irrevocably change him. The first task was deceptively simple, yet it felt like an act of profound betrayal. David instructed Elias to discreetly identify key Hezbollah positions within the village, focusing on patterns, movements, and potential supply points. He was to use his pastoral duties as a cover, his natural interactions with his community as a means of observation. The old olive grove, the shepherd's hut, the derelict barn, these were his initial targets. He was to note details, however small, that might confirm or deny David's intelligence. A sense of profound guilt and fear began to consume Elias, a cold dread that settled deep in his bones. Each step he took, each familiar face he greeted, was now tainted by the secret he carried. His first, seemingly innocent act of betrayal came during the afternoon benediction. As he walked through the village, offering blessings and comfort, he paused near the old olive grove. He saw a young man, a familiar face from his congregation, talking intently with a stranger, pointing towards the ground. Elias, feigning a moment of contemplative prayer, subtly adjusted his hand, a small, almost imperceptible signal David had instructed him to use if he observed anything significant. It was a slight movement, a shift of his ring finger against his palm, barely noticeable to anyone but a trained observer. Yet in that fleeting gesture, Elias felt the first tremor of his soul cracking, the irreversible step into a world of shadows and deceit. He was no longer just Pastor Elias. He was now a man divided, bound by a secret that would haunt his every waking moment. Elias began his clandestine work with a forced calm that belied the storm raging within him. His pastoral duties, once a source of solace and spiritual fulfillment, now served as an elaborate and increasingly suffocating cover. He visited the sick, counseled the troubled, and officiated at ceremonies, all while his eyes meticulously scanned for anomalies, his ears acutely tuned to stray conversations. Each interaction, each seemingly innocent observation, chipped away at his conscience, leaving behind a growing residue of shame and self-loathing. The weight of his secret became a physical burden, pressing down on his shoulders, making every step feel heavy, every breath a conscious effort. He found himself avoiding the gaze of his parishioners, fearing they might somehow perceive the deceit festering beneath his clerical robes. Hezbollah, meanwhile, was not oblivious. Subtle changes began to ripple through their patterns, more frequent patrols, new faces among their ranks, and an almost imperceptible shift in their staging areas suggested a heightened state of alert. Elias noticed these shifts, reporting them to David, who interpreted them as signs of their effectiveness. The very success of Elias's initial cautious observations led to David's growing demands. What began as requests for general locations soon escalated to specific timing of movements, numbers of personnel, and even details of their communication methods. Elias, to his own horror, found himself developing an almost unnatural expertise in covert observation. He learned to distinguish the subtle hum of a hidden generator from the ambient village noise, to identify the specific vehicles used by certain commanders, and to gauge the morale of the fighters by their posture and interactions. It was a skill he never imagined possessing, a dark talent forged in the crucible of his moral compromise. One evening, while discreetly mapping a newly established observation post on the village's periphery, Elias experienced a terrifying close call. He had ventured out under the guise of an urgent late-night visit to a sick parishioner, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. As he knelt behind a cluster of gnarled olive trees, sketching details onto a small hidden notepad, a sudden guttural challenge echoed from the darkness. "Who's there?" A beam of light cut through the night, sweeping dangerously close. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had been so engrossed in his task that he had missed the approach of a Hezbollah patrol. Thinking quickly, he adopted the hunched posture of an elderly man suffering from a sudden ailment, clutching his chest and letting out a ragged groan. The patrol leader, a stern-faced young man he recognized from his congregation, approached cautiously. "Pastor Elias, are you ill?" Elias stammered out a plausible excuse about a sudden bout of indigestion, his face contorted in a convincing grimace. The young man, though suspicious, offered assistance, eventually escorting the trembling pastor back towards the village center, unknowingly saving him from certain exposure. Elias's quick thinking, born of sheer terror, had averted disaster, but the incident left him shaken, a stark reminder of the ever-present danger. Then came the first tangible result of his actions. Days after providing detailed intelligence on a remote Hezbollah arms cache located several kilometers outside the village, a distant, muffled explosion rattled the windows of his church. Later, David confirmed it. A successful, albeit remote strike based entirely on Elias's intelligence. The news brought a bewildering mix of relief and horror. Relief that his efforts were not in vain, that he was indeed contributing to the protection of his people. But horror, too, at the realization of his direct complicity in an act of war, at the anonymous lives that might have been lost because of his silent observations. The sound of that distant explosion reverberated not just through the valley, but deep within Elias's soul, marking an irreversible turn in his perilous journey. The reverberations of the distant explosion lingered, a constant echo in Elias's mind, a stark reminder of the terrible power he now wielded through his clandestine actions. He had thought the horror would subside, that the relief of a successful intervention would outweigh the guilt, but it only deepened his internal chasm. Each sunrise brought a fresh wave of dread, each sunset a heavier burden of secrets. His days were a performance, his nights a torment. He moved through his pastoral duties with a practiced smile, his eyes, however, betraying a deep-seated weariness that no amount of prayer could alleviate. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, suffocating his spirit, and he found himself increasingly detached, observing his congregation as if from a great distance. Then the unthinkable happened. shattering the fragile facade he had so meticulously constructed. A tremor of whispers began to ripple through the village, growing louder, more insistent, until they coalesced into a name that punched the air from Elias's lungs. Karim. Karim, a young man from his congregation, barely out of adolescence, whose mother Elias had comforted through countless illnesses, whose baptism he had performed with joy. Karim was now implicated in Hezbollah activities, not as a peripheral supporter, but as an active participant in their local network. The news hit Elias with the force of a physical blow, a visceral agony that dwarfed all previous moral quandaries. This was not a distant, anonymous target. This was a boy he knew, a soul he had pledged to guide. A desperate, icy dread seized Elias. He immediately understood the implications. If Karim was indeed involved, he would inevitably be caught in the crosshairs of the intelligence he himself was providing. David's cold, calculating voice echoed in his memory. The boy is a necessary casualty for the greater objective. Elias felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. How could he stand by and allow this? How could he, a shepherd, lead a lamb to slaughter, even if that lamb had strayed? His conscience screamed, tearing at the fabric of his carefully constructed justification. He knew he had to act, even if it meant risking everything. Under the guise of a pastoral visit, Elias sought out Karim, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found the young man in the village square, laughing with friends, a picture of youthful innocence stained by the grim reality of his affiliations. Elias pulled Karim aside, his voice low, urgent, his eyes pleading. He spoke in parables, in veiled warnings about the dangers of certain paths, about the shadows that lurked unseen, about the importance of family and faith. He tried to convey the urgency, the impending doom, without explicitly revealing his own perilous position. Karim listened, confused, perhaps a little resentful of the pastor's unexpected gravity, but he offered no sign of understanding the true depth of Elias's desperate warning. Elias watched him walk away, a knot of despair tightening in his chest, knowing he had done all he could, and yet it felt like nothing at all. The tragic outcome followed swiftly, brutally. Days later, news spread like wildfire through the village. Karim had been captured during a raid on a suspected Hezbollah cell in a neighboring town. Some whispered he had been killed resisting arrest, others that he was being interrogated, his fate uncertain but undoubtedly grim. Elias heard the hushed conversations, saw the tearful eyes of Karim's mother, felt the collective grief and fear of his congregation. Each whispered word, each sorrowful glance, was a dagger twisting in his gut. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his intelligence, his desperate attempt to protect his flock, had directly or indirectly led to Karim's capture or death. A profound grief and self-loathing consumed Elias. He locked himself in his study, the weight of his guilt suffocating him. The faces of his parishioners, once a source of comfort, now haunted him, each one a silent accusation. His faith, once an unshakable anchor, now felt like a crumbling ruin. He questioned everything, his vows, his purpose, his very soul. This was the true cost of his collaboration, a price far higher than he had ever imagined. The distant explosion was a mere echo. Karim's fate was a personal catastrophe, a gaping wound that would never heal. Elias understood then that he was not just a tool in a larger geopolitical game. He was an accomplice, his hands stained by the blood of his own. Elias's behavior, once a beacon of steadfast calm, began to unravel subtly yet noticeably. His sermons, usually filled with inspiring parables and comforting assurances, now carried an undercurrent of existential dread, a weariness that seeped into his very bones. He moved through the village like a ghost, his eyes hollow, his smile a forced, brittle thing that never quite reached his eyes. He often found himself staring blankly into the distance, lost in a torment only he could comprehend, his once robust appetite dwindling to almost nothing. These changes did not go unnoticed by the keen eyes of his congregants, particularly the elders who had known him since his youth. One such elder, Miriam, a woman whose wisdom was as etched into her face as the lines of time, approached him after a particularly despondent service. She did not pry, but her gaze, filled with ancient understanding, seemed to penetrate the layers of his carefully constructed facade. "The shepherd carries the burdens of his flock, Elias," she murmured, her voice soft as velvet, yet firm with unspoken knowledge. "But even the strongest shepherd needs to rest his heart." Her words were not a question, but an invitation, a silent offer of solace that Elias, in his profound isolation, found himself unable to accept, yet deeply touched by. He merely nodded, a flicker of something akin to gratitude passing through his haunted eyes, before retreating further into his shell of guilt. Meanwhile, the intricate web of Hezbollah's intelligence network, always vigilant, began to tighten around the Christian village. Karim's capture, a high-profile incident, had triggered an internal investigation, leading them closer and closer to the source of the leak. Their suspicions, initially vague and dismissed as paranoia, solidified with each intercepted communication and each anomaly in their own operational security. They started noticing subtle patterns, movements of their operatives that were too easily anticipated, caches of weapons that seemed to vanish before they could be used, and, most damningly, a series of preemptive strikes by the opposing forces that were too precise to be coincidental. The trail, though faint, led inexorably back to the heart of the village, and by extension to its most unlikely informant. Then came the message, a stark, chilling reality delivered not by digital means, but by a crumpled, anonymous note tucked beneath a stone at his church's entrance. The words, crudely scrawled in Arabic, were unmistakable. "The wolf in shepherd's clothing will soon be unmasked." Elias felt a cold dread snake through him, confirming his deepest fears. He was compromised. His time was running out. David, ever the pragmatist, received the same intelligence through his own channels. He immediately initiated contingency plans for Elias's extraction. "It's over, Elias." David's voice crackled through the encrypted line, devoid of emotion. "We're pulling you out. Prepare for immediate exfiltration." But Elias, his voice raw with a newfound resolve, refused. "No," he stated, his decision firm. "I am not leaving. This is my home, my flock. I started this, and I will see it through." He felt an overwhelming responsibility, a grim determination to face the consequences of his actions, to perhaps even atone for Karim's fate. There was one final, critical piece of intelligence Elias knew he had to deliver. It was a plan overheard in hushed conversations, concerning a major Hezbollah operation targeting a vital supply route, an operation that, if successful, would plunge the region into deeper conflict. He knew delivering this information would be his last act, a final, desperate gamble. He could feel the eyes on him now, the invisible net drawing tighter. He had become a pawn, a sacrifice, in a game far larger than himself. He understood, with a chilling clarity, that the trap was set. He was walking into danger, a lamb consciously heading towards the slaughter, but this time it was for his own flock, for the innocent lives he still desperately hoped to protect. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating, yet a strange, almost defiant peace settled within his tormented soul. The air in the small Lebanese village thickened with an unspoken tension, a palpable sense of foreboding that clung to every shadow. Elias, his clerical collar feeling like a noose, walked with a deliberate calmness towards the makeshift command center Hezbollah had established in a requisitioned schoolhouse. He knew the risk, understood the finality of this confrontation. Inside, Commander Hassan, a man whose eyes held the cold, calculating glint of absolute conviction, awaited him. Hassan, a figure whose reputation for ruthlessness was only matched by his strategic acumen, had summoned Elias, not through a formal request, but with an implicit command that brooked no defiance. Elias stepped into the room, the scent of stale coffee and gunpowder hanging heavy. Hassan sat behind a scarred wooden desk, flanked by 2 armed guards, their faces impassive. There was no greeting, no pleasantries exchanged. Hassan merely fixed Elias with an unwavering stare, his gaze piercing through the pastor's carefully constructed facade. "Pastor Elias," Hassan began, his voice surprisingly soft, yet laced with an undeniable menace. "We have heard many things about you, good things, and other things." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, a silent accusation. Elias felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine, but he met Hassan's gaze, refusing to flinch. "Commander," Elias replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I am a man of God. My only concern is the well-being of my flock, of this village." Hassan merely offered a mirthless smile, a gesture that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. "Indeed," the commander purred, "a shepherd protecting his sheep, a noble pursuit. But even shepherds can lead their flock astray, or perhaps lead them to another's pasture." Hassan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We know, Pastor, we know about your discussions, your little signals, your foreign friends." The words were delivered like precise dagger thrusts, each one finding its mark. Hassan held up a small, crudely drawn map, identical to one Elias had meticulously sketched for David weeks ago, highlighting Hezbollah positions. "This map, Pastor, it was found, and it points directly to your extracurricular activities." Elias felt a wave of despair wash over him, but also a strange sense of liberation. The secret, the unbearable burden, was out. There was no more hiding. "My motivations," Elias began, his voice gaining strength, "were for peace, for the safety of these innocent lives caught between forces far greater than themselves. I saw a threat, Commander, a threat to my people, and I sought to neutralize it." He spoke not of guilt, but of a desperate, perhaps misguided, attempt at protection. He confessed not to betrayal, but to the driving force behind his actions, the desperate love for his congregation. Just as Hassan's expression hardened, his hand beginning to move towards a pistol holstered at his side, a deafening explosion ripped through the quiet afternoon. The schoolhouse rattled violently, dust rained from the ceiling, and the windows shattered inwards. The ground trembled beneath their feet as a second, even larger blast echoed from the outskirts of the village. The preemptive strike, based on Elias's final intelligence, had begun. Chaos erupted instantly. Guards shouted, alarms blared, and the distant sounds of gunfire and further explosions filled the air. Hassan's focus, momentarily diverted from Elias, shifted to the unfolding disaster. Amidst the pandemonium, a wall section of the schoolhouse crumbled inwards, trapping several villagers who had sought shelter in an adjacent room. Their cries for help pierced through the din. Without a moment's hesitation, Elias, his confrontation with Hassan momentarily forgotten, instinctively rushed towards the collapsing debris. He began frantically pulling at the rubble, ignoring the shouts of the confused guards and the furious gaze of Hassan, who was now barking orders into a crackling radio. Elias's actions were pure, unadulterated instinct, a return to his core purpose. He heaved a heavy concrete slab, his strength fueled by adrenaline and an overwhelming need to atone. He pulled a terrified young mother and her infant from the wreckage, shielding them with his own body as more debris fell. In that moment, stripped of his clandestine role, the pastor was simply a man, risking everything to save his flock, proving in the most visceral way possible where his true loyalty lay. The dust slowly settled, revealing a landscape forever altered. The village, once a sanctuary, now bore the scars of conflict. Buildings stood partially collapsed, their skeletal remains testament to the ferocity of the strike. Yet, amidst the devastation, a fragile sense of survival permeated the air. The immediate threat, the entrenched Hezbollah positions that had cast a long shadow over their lives, had been neutralized. Elias, his cassock torn and stained with dust and blood, moved through the wreckage, helping where he could, his face a mask of exhaustion and profound sorrow. He had saved lives, yes, but at an unimaginable cost. The villagers' reactions to Elias were a complex tapestry of emotions. Some regarded him with awe, an unwitting hero who had, through his desperate actions, averted a greater catastrophe. They remembered his selfless courage amidst the crumbling schoolhouse, his unwavering commitment to rescuing those trapped. Others, however, viewed him with suspicion, even outright hostility. Whispers followed him through the makeshift aid stations, hushed tones questioning his involvement, his secrets, and the true extent of his collaboration. He was both savior and pariah, his actions deeply divisive, tearing at the fabric of the close-knit community he had once bound together. The pastor, who had preached unity and forgiveness, had inadvertently sown seeds of discord. Days later, in the quiet solemnity of his damaged church, Elias made his decision. He stood before the few remaining elders, his voice raspy but firm. He could no longer stand at the altar, could no longer preach from a place of such profound compromise. His soul felt tainted, his spiritual authority irrevocably fractured. He resigned from his pastoral duties, a heavy weight lifting from his shoulders, even as a new, profound emptiness settled in his chest. He explained his motivations, not seeking absolution, but offering an honest account of the choices he had made, the desperate hope that had driven him, and the terrible price he had paid. The elders listened, their faces etched with a mixture of understanding and sorrow, for they knew the burden he carried. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the recovering village, a familiar, unwelcome figure appeared at Elias's door. David, impeccably dressed despite the surrounding chaos, offered a wry, almost sympathetic smile. "Pastor," he began, his voice devoid of its usual persuasive charm, "it seems our work here is done, and for you, a new chapter awaits." He spoke of a new life, a new identity, far from the shattered remnants of Elias's past. He presented documents, tickets, a promise of anonymity and safety in a distant land. It was an escape, a chance to shed the burden of his choices, to disappear into the anonymity of a new beginning. Elias looked at the papers, then out at the struggling village, at the faces of his people, some still angry, some grateful, all scarred. He thought of the young mother and her infant he had pulled from the rubble, their eyes wide with terror and then relief. He thought of the young man, his congregant, whose fate remained a haunting enigma, a constant reminder of the collateral damage of his mission. He could not leave. He could not abandon them, not now, not after everything. His choice was clear. He would remain, face the consequences, and try in his own way to help rebuild not just the village, but its fractured spirit. His final act as a spiritual leader, before stepping down completely, was not a sermon of easy forgiveness or comforting platitudes. Instead, it was a raw, deeply personal address delivered to the assembled villagers, a gathering far smaller than any he had ever presided over. He spoke of the unbearable weight of moral choices, of the gray areas where good intentions could lead to devastating outcomes. He spoke of love, not as a simplistic emotion, but as a fierce protective force that could drive a man to unimaginable lengths. He spoke of the enduring power of community, of the necessity of healing, and the long, arduous path towards reconciliation. He did not seek to justify his actions, but to lay bare the complexity of his heart. As Elias concluded, a profound silence fell over the small congregation. He had offered no easy answers, no comforting resolution, only the stark truth of his experience. The lingering question hung heavy in the air, echoing in the hearts of every villager, and most profoundly, in Elias's own soul. Was it worth it? The immediate threat was gone, but the village was broken, and Elias, the shepherd, was no longer whole. His choices had saved lives, but had also irrevocably altered his own, leaving him with a lingering shadow, a profound and permanent impact on his soul and the community he had sworn to protect. The dawn was new, but the scars remained, a testament to the terrible cost of desperate measures